Hello and welcome to our lesson on solving percent problems. So as an introduction, let's think about a 50 question test and think about how many questions did you get correct if your score was 80%. Well, what do we know about 80%? We know 80% means that we have 80 per 100. So if you had a 100 question test, you would have gotten 80 questions correct. Now you didn't have a 100 question test. You had a 50 question test. So think about how many questions you would have gotten correct. Well, one way to think about this is we can think of it as a part to whole relationship and set up a ratio table. And we know that 80% can be written as a part to whole of 80 and 100. And on a 50 question test, we want to know what is the part that we got correct out of that total, out of the whole amount of 50. Well, if we think in terms of ratio tables, we know we can get to 50 by dividing by 2. So that means if we divide 80 by 2, we will find out how many we got correct for that 50 question test, which is 40. And today's lesson is all about finding these percents. So we could actually say 80% of a 50 question test, so 80% of a 50 question test is 40 questions correct. So if you got 80 questions correct out of a 50 question test, that is 40 questions correct. So we're going to use double number lines, we're going to use these ratio tables, and we're going to use fraction multiplication to do these types of problems. So looking at a double number line, let's again think about this 50 question test. How many questions did you get correct for each percentage? Well, if you got 100% on a 50 question test, you would have gotten 50 questions correct. And obviously, if you unfortunately scored a 0%, you would have gotten 0 questions correct. Now, I like to think of two key percentages whenever I'm using a double number line. One of the key percentages I like to use is 50%. And I like to use 50% because that tells me if my answers make sense, because if I have 50% and I know what that is, I know all of the percentages less than should have a value less than that 50% value. And all of my percentages higher should have values that are higher than my halfway mark here. So 50% is half of 50, and I can think of that as kind of like a ratio tables. How do I go from 100% to 50%? Well, I would divide by 2 to get 50%. So for 50, my value, I would need to divide that by 2, and that would give me 25. So if I scored a 50% on a 50 question test, I would have 25 questions correct. All right, so that's kind of my benchmark to help me make sure my numbers make sense. Now the other extremely valuable percent to calculate right away is the 10%. And the 10% helps me because each of these increments is 10%, and it makes it really easy to fill in the rest of the number line. The other nice thing about 10% is it's really easy to calculate, because how do we go from 100% to 10%? We need to divide by 10. 100 divided by 10 is 10. So to find that value, easy enough. 50 divided by 10 gives me my 10% value, which is 5. And now I know every 10% is going to be another 5 questions correct. So what is 20%? That's 10. 30% is 15. 40% is 20. And we just go ahead and fill in the rest of the number line using those values. And notice, like we saw on the previous slide, 80% is that 40 questions correct. All right, so why don't you give this one a try? What if you had a 40 question test? How many questions did you get correct for each percentage? So if you got 100%, you would have gotten 40, 0%, 0. So go ahead and figure out that 50%. figure out that 10%, and then fill in your number line from there. All right, and there are the values for that. Obviously, 50% is 20, 10% is 4, so each 10% we go up by an increment of 4 questions. So let's use these double number lines to solve some problems. So we want to find the percent of the number. So 90% of 20 questions would be how much? Now, notice it doesn't say 20 questions because it could be what's 90% of $20? What's 90% of 20 marbles? So this 20 can represent just about any quantity you could think of, and we want to find out what is 90% of that quantity. Now we don't have to fill in every value in the number line, but we can be smart about it and get to our answer relatively quickly. So if I had 100% of 20, well, that would be 20. So I'm going to put 20 as my 100%. And our goal is to find out what is this 90%. Well, let's go ahead and figure out what is 50%, just to kind of help us with a number that makes sense. So 50% would be 10. So now I know, since I know this 50%, I know 90% is greater than 10, so my answer better be greater than 10. I think it will be helpful to find this 10%. So 10% is, well, 100% divided by 10 is 10%. 20 divided by 10 is 2. So I know 10% is 2. And let me just fill in 0% is 0. Now I could just go ahead and count up by 2's to get to 90%. That works. Or I know 10 times 9 is 90%. So 2 times 9 is 18. Another way to think of it, 100% minus 10% is 90. So 20 minus 10% is 2. 20 minus 2 is 18. Many ways to think about it, but I can now say 90% of 20 is 18. Let's look at another one. So this one I've done already to save some time. So what is 75% of 32? So 100% is 32, 50% is 16, 10% is 3 and 2/10. That's really not that helpful in this case. But if I use this 50%, I can easily figure out what 25% is because that's half. And what's half of 16? It is 8. And once I have 25%, makes it really easy to find 75%. I can multiply by 3. 25 times 3 is 75. 8 times 3 is 24. Or I can add 25% and 50% is 75%. 8 plus 16 is 24. So 75% of 32 is 24. So here's a couple for you to try. So what is 25% of 40? So again, you're going to start off with 40 would be 100%, 0% would be 0. Go ahead and find 50%. Now 10% is not going to be super helpful, but if you want, you can figure out 10%. But once you know that 50%, well, we know 25% is half of that, so go ahead and give that a try. All right, so 50% of 40 is 20, so then half of that, 25%, would be 10. So 25% of 40 is 10. How about 60% of 150? So again, 100% is going to be 150. I would go ahead and find 50%. I would find 10%, and from there you should be able to derive what 60% is. All right, so 50% is half of 150, which is 75. 10%, you divide 150 by 10 and get 15. And from there, you can add 15 and 75 to get 90, because 10 plus 50 is 60%. Or 10 times 6 is 60. 15 times 6 is 90. Now we can use other methods besides double number lines if we remember that percents are part to whole ratios. and we can use the ratio table like we did in our introduction. So let's look at 90% of 20, and let's go ahead and set up our part to whole ratio table. And we know 90% is 90 over 100, and we want to figure out, well, if we have 20 as our whole, what is going to be the part of that? Now if I look at this, I don't need to simplify 90 over 100 because there is a direct way to get to 20 from 100 by dividing by 5. So 100 divided by 5 is 20, so now I could do 90 divided by 5. And if I do 90 divided by 5, that gives me 18. Just like with the double number line, 90% of 20 is 18. Here's another example. Now for 75% of 32, there is no great way to go from 100 to 32 by using multiplication or division. So in this case, I did simplify 75 over 100 down to 3 to 4. And once I have 3 to 4, it's easy to scale up by 8 to get to 32, and 3 times 8 is 24. So try the 2 on your own from before using a ratio table instead. So try and do 25% of 40 using a ratio table. All right, so again, you get 10. You would simplify 25 over 100 down to 1 to 4 and scale up by 10 to get 10 to 40. So 25% of 40 is 10. Go ahead and try 60% of 150 using a ratio table. So 60 over 100, you could simplify it all the way down to 3/5. Maybe you scaled it down to 6/10. I went ahead, I just scaled it down to 30 over 50. So you had multiple options with 60 over 100. But if I do 60 over 100 is 30 over 50, then I can scale up by multiplying by 3. 30 times 3 is 90. So 60% of 150 is 90. So no matter how you scaled, how you simplified 60 over 100, you should still get up to 90 over 150. All right, last but not least, let's look at fraction multiplication as a method. So remember, if we have a quantity of another quantity, this of right here means we can multiply these two quantities together to get the answer. Now the only way that we know how to multiply these two numbers is to use fraction multiplication. And we know how to write 90% as a fraction, so actually it's not too bad. So we remember that 90% is equal to 90 per 100. So 90% of 20 is 90 over 100. That's our 90% of 20. And we can do this multiplication. Now remember, when we do fraction multiplication, we take any whole numbers and we put them over 1 to make them an improper fraction. And now we can either multiply numerators and denominators, then simplify, or we can simplify before we multiply. So I prefer to simplify before we multiply. So any numerator with any denominator, so 90 over 100, those are both divisible by 10. I can make that 9 over 10. And then I have this 20 and this 10, so those are both divisible by 10. So 10 divided by 10 is 1. 20 divided by 10 is 2. And now in the numerator I have 9 times 2. In the denominator 1 times 1, which gives me 18 over 1, which is 18, like we've gotten in our previous examples. So 90% of 20 is again 18, this time using fraction multiplication. Looking at our other example, 75% is 75 over 100 times 32. Simplify, multiply, and we get 24. All right, so try the on your owns, this time using fraction multiplication. So 25% of 40. So that's 25 over 100 times 40. After simplifying, you do again get 10. One last one. 60% of 150. So 60 over 100 times 150, simplify and multiply, and again you get 90. So you do have three methods to choose from. You can use any method on homework or a quiz or a test, whatever you're more comfortable with. Sometimes with more challenging numbers, fraction multiplication is going to be the easier method. So just kind of keep that in mind as you're working through different problems. All right, well, that'll do it for today's lesson.